Let's talk about pressure testing. What pressure testing is in the martial arts sense is taking the techniques that you've learned or that you're currently practicing and applying resistance to them by your opponent. This makes the situation a little more realistic because your opponent is no longer just compliant and allowing you to move their body freely. A lot of schools get criticized for not implementing this enough or even not implementing it at all in their training. But is it possible to do too much pressure testing? And is there a wrong way to do it? I think we can start by all agreeing that techniques without pressure testing are as good as useless. You might have the most perfect wrist locks or the world's greatest shoulder throws, but I hate to break it to you, if you've only been practicing these techniques on a person that's just standing there motionless, basically a mannequin, then good luck trying to get that to work literally anywhere else. People don't need an ounce of training to instinctively know to resist you when you're trying to manipulate their body. They might not know how to counter your techniques or put you into submission, but they can easily throw a wrench into your plans by changing the angle of their arms or legs or just slightly moving. And in most cases, this situation would be worse for you than if you just weren't trained at all, because then you would just be relying on your fight or flight instead of trying to make this one singular move work that's not working. So pressure testing is extremely vital and important, but I think I would put an asterisk on that sentence. I definitely think there's a wrong way to go about it. I've personally been to locations where their version of pressure testing is showing you a technique that you've never done before and then pairing you up with somebody and just telling them to not allow you to do that technique and then you trying to do that on them. I have a problem with that approach because if you never practice that technique in ideal conditions, then you never understand how it actually works. You're making it a lot harder on yourself and a lot more dangerous for your opponent if you don't give yourself the benefit of just practicing it a little bit with them not doing anything to resist you. I know that's performing the deadly sin of practicing on a completely compliant opponent, but it serves a purpose. Like I said, starting with seeing the technique through slowly and step by step without any other variables distracting you allows your brain to process what is the correct way to do the technique and what you're actually supposed to be doing. And of course we know that technique would never go that cleanly in the streets and it would never happen that way, but that's not the reason we're doing that. It's to give us a foundation of the technique and a starting point so that we have something to build off of. Isn't that just the definition of foundation? Now I know a lot of schools will do that, but then they'll spend the rest of their training in that small circle of compliance for the rest of the time. And that's also a problem, but I think what I'm describing is a proper middle ground between the two extremes. So once you're comfortable with this technique in ideal conditions, and that could take anywhere from days, weeks, or months, depending on the complexity of the technique and your ability to learn it, I still don't think you should jump into full-fledged sparring with that technique. I still think there's a process before that. But once you have a baseline, then what you can do is have your opponent resist whatever technique you're trying to perform, and then just experimenting with what you can do from that. Most of the time you'll have to turn this technique into a completely different technique based on what your opponent is doing against you. Now at this stage as an instructor, if they're a beginner, I like to provide that secondary technique for them. I'll tell them that the opponent is going to do X motion to resist them. So at this point everything is still scripted, but you're one step further than you were at the beginning because now you're understanding how to feel what your opponent is doing and feel what their body's doing so that you can use their energy against them. At least that's what we do in our Hapkido training. And no, that doesn't mean that every opponent that you go against is going to have the same resistance to that technique. But starting with one counter is a good building process and it doesn't flood your mind with too much complexity. And once they're comfortable with one counter, then you can introduce a different counter because a different opponent might resist in a different way. And then you can turn it around by starting with a different technique, which is just serving to coax them into the original technique that you learned, which is just the way that things normally work. It's usually never the first direction that you go that you're going to end up going. And at this point in the process, the students can become creative and try to resist in different ways and see if they can come up with their own combinations to come from that. And I love what-if scenarios. There's some that I'm used to hearing more than others, but sometimes somebody will come up with something that I've never seen before. And I know as an instructor, it could be intimidating to come across something you haven't experienced before or haven't dealt with, and you don't want to look like you don't know what you're talking about. So some people will shy away from that topic or try to move on to something else. But I think it's so much better to welcome that challenge and, put your pride aside for a second and do try to experiment with that what-if scenario and try to figure out something on the spot with everybody. And, have the students do the same thing and you might come to a new conclusion or you might learn something new. I think that whole communal learning idea is so productive and it might be a little less popular than just having that dictatorship style class where The instructor tells you that you're supposed to move in this direction, or you're supposed to fall down when this happens. And when they're performing a technique on you, they tell you when you're supposed to feel pain, and they tell you when to tap and stuff like that. I know when you're experienced, you're supposed to have all the answers, but sometimes you just need to put your pride aside and open your mind, and you can get a lot further that way. So eventually you can continue building this process, and you can start over with new techniques that you teach your students. And once you have a pretty good arsenal of things that you know, then you can jump into like the full-on pressure testing. This is just what I would call sparring, where you just have two people equally go up against each other and try to get to a submission or a takedown. Use the techniques that they know. The opponent is going to resist them and see if they can use any of those counters that they've been practicing. And this final zone of pressure testing is really important because that's where you complete that circle of learning and where you figure out what actually works and what doesn't. So in general, the more you practice something, the closer you're going to get to that limit of complete knowledge, which we can never reach, but we can only get closer to. So more pressure testing will expose you to more scenarios and make you more prepared, and you'll be more well-rounded. But more full-speed sparring like that, where you're pulling on people's joints and twisting them in certain ways, is definitely more risky. I personally don't advocate for spending most to all of your time with that full-speed pressure testing, because I don't want to send a bunch of students home with severe injuries all the time. And I think a little bit of that practice can go a long way. To me, what's much more important in preventing injuries pressure testing is to introduce it in that staged layout, because the students are grasping and understanding in a step-by-step manner instead of being thrown directly into a fire naive. If you just throw a bunch of people with little to no practice into a full-speed sparring match, then you're probably going to go out of business with the amount of injuries that you're going to have on the first day. We all know balance is extremely important, and each school gets to decide for themselves where they draw that line on how much pressure testing is too much. But my approach is to make that little time you spend in that final stage of pressure testing time well spent. And the way you do that, in my opinion, is with the process I explained earlier, where you divide it into steps, where the student has to spend a certain amount of time in each of these stages before they can move on to the next. If you're interested, maybe I can do a video where I take a basic technique through that entire process and demonstrate how I would teach it and how I would apply it at each different stage. What I'm always trying to do is bring people together, and I know that there's arguments on this topic, but I hope with this video I can help two sides come to more common ground and understand each other better and why they do the things they do. I think we agree with each other a lot more than we realize. We're just in this two-sided world where everything seems to be so extreme, and you have to argue with somebody just because they think a little bit differently than you. But I think we're a lot more alike than we think. Thank you guys for watching, and keep training.